Hello everyone and welcome to our panel discussion, which will explore how organisations can benefit from incentives to deploy EV charging infrastructure. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion, which is sponsored by Flow EV Charging.
We created Add Energy in 2009 with a single purpose: to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. From the outset, we knew that developing the best charging experience was going to play a key role in that transition. We took no shortcuts and embraced all the challenges involved, from station design to software development, from network operation to manufacturing. We wanted to prove that EV charging could be simple and reliable and provide an experience where things just flow. After more than a decade in business, we continue our journey ahead, always keen to embrace new challenges. We have developed solutions for key market segments, building a comprehensive offering to better meet the needs of EV drivers.
We're grateful to Flow's support in enabling this webinar to take place, and thanks for that video. Well, a dramatic increase in the number of public electric vehicle charging stations in Canada is required to support the forthcoming wave of EVs that are going to be hitting the market and the federal government's targets for zero emission vehicle adoption. So at what point should organisations such as cities, municipalities, retailers, workplaces, as well as fleet operators and other site hosts plan to install EV chargers? What are the business cases they should consider, and the public funding options that are available? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing today. Right, let's meet our panel. They are Ian Neville, Senior Sustainability Specialist at the City of Vancouver; Mary Quintana, Director, Asset Management and Utilities at Brock University; Cara Clareman, President and CEO at Plug and Drive; Brooke Sheehan, Sales Director at Flow EV Charging. Well, welcome to the panelists and welcome to all the audience who've zoomed in. I'd like to start by inviting each panelist to introduce their roles and their organisation, and let's take it in the order of the introductions just now. So Ian, would you just like to kick us off?
Sure, great. Thanks, Nino, and thanks for having me. I'm Ian Neville. I'm a Senior Sustainability Specialist at the City of Vancouver. I lead our policy and strategic direction with regard to electric vehicle infrastructure in the public realm, and sort of everything we're doing to try and advance EV adoption more broadly across the city.
Thanks, Ian. And Mary, over to you.
Hi, I'm Mary Quintana, Director of Management and Utilities at Brock. Brock University is located in the Niagara region on a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And my role here is to look after electricity, the district energy system as well, some of the other assets that are flagship buildings, and sustainability is also in my portfolio. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary. And Cara.
Thanks, Nino. Cara Clareman, President and CEO of Plug and Drive. Plug and Drive is a nonprofit all about helping consumers make the switch. So we focus a lot of our effort on education as well as some research and policy work. And very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for taking part. And Brooks.
Hi, thanks, Nino. Brooke Sheehan, I'm the U.S. Sales Director for Flow. I've been with Flow for 5 years and helped build out our Ontario and Central Canada region for all things Flow EV charging. And now I am heading up our U.S. expansion.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brooks, and everyone for joining us. And yeah, let's get into the get into the conversation. And Cara, if perhaps you'd like to really just help us set the scene for where we are right now with EV adoption and where we're likely to be
Sure.
in the near future, and what you expect the demand to be around EV chargers.
Well, thanks. Look, I wish I knew exactly. If I did, I think maybe yeah, I'd be maybe I'd be in a different role. But what I can say is this. So we're, Canada's doing okay with EV adoption. We're running around, 4% of new car sales, 4 and a bit. And that's not bad for a small population country. The thing that is interesting about Canada is our adoption is extremely uneven across the country. So, we have really great numbers coming in out of BC at, as much as 11 or 12%, depending on which study you look at, and Quebec, hovering around 8 or 9%. And the rest of the country sort of down in the low, 2% and below. And I think, it's quite apparent that the different policy frameworks that we have in the different provinces are really making a big difference. So, in Quebec and BC, where we have provincial incentives that stack upon the federal incentive, we see a big difference compared to the rest of the country. Now, it'll be interesting to watch because a lot of other provinces have added incentives. We're up to, I think, 6 provinces with provincial incentives. And so we are going to see changes there. It's early days. Ontario, it's hard to say how we'll do. We still don't have any additional incentives here, although what we do have is a big push on manufacturing, which is fantastic, but we won't see the results of that probably for 2 years. So for right now, I think there's a lot we need to do as a country if we really want to accelerate adoption across the whole nation.
Thanks. That's a great overview. And what so obviously critical from the incentive side, from the infrastructure side, what are the kind of moves that we need to be planning for and making now, do you think, in terms of ramping up our charging infrastructure relative to where it is now?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually we're doing pretty well across the country. I mean, for those of us, and I think some in this group, who've been driving EVs for 10 years, that the first year I had my EV in 2011, there were two fast chargers or level 3 stations in all of Ontario. And they were both about a mile from each other in Mississauga. And so, when you compare that to today with, many hundreds of stations and many thousands across the country, we've actually done a lot in 10 years. And so, I hate to, of course we can do more, and of course we need more, but I wouldn't want to suggest that there isn't enough now for people to adopt the cars, because what I hear from a lot of people is, oh, I'd love to get an EV, except, there's not enough chargers. And I said, just take a look at the PlugShare or ChargeHub map. There actually are a lot. It's just that you don't see them because you're not looking for them. And so I don't want to give the impression there isn't infrastructure, but of course we can do better. And I think one of the main thing is, of course, on the main highways, we've done a good job. Where we've done, less good is in the more remote parts of the country, which there are many. We're starting to see it build out, but it's still a bit sketchy if you want to make a very remote trip.
Great, thanks for the overview. And Ian, Vancouver's leading the way with some very progressive EV policies, and Cara highlighted some of the adoption rates in BC right now overall. From your point of view, as advice for other municipalities who might be listening in, why is public EV charging so critical for your city?
Thanks, Nino. So for us, there's kind of an interplay between home charging and public charging. We've had new construction requirements for home charging for a number of years now, which I think is great for folks moving into new buildings. And it has resulted in quite a lot of infrastructure that means we don't need to build on the public side. But public charging really does fill an important niche for all those folks who maybe can't retrofit their home, or they live in a multifamily building that can't or won't make those upgrades. Nearly 2/3 of Vancouverites live in multifamily buildings, so that is a big challenge. Certainly, if you're in a home, like if you live in a basement suite and you don't have access to a garage, all those reasons mean that we want to have public charging, and particularly DC fast charging out there to support those folks. And having that charging in places where people would go anyway, I think, is the key thing. Given that charging is not as fast as going to the gas station, there is still some pause time. It may be just a few minutes, but there's definitely even a psychological aspect to that. So ensuring that your charging is put, at the grocery store, or if it's a level 2, like community center, or restaurant, somewhere people will be a little bit longer. But the idea is that it's convenient. You're not creating new driving trips just to charge your car. And I think public charging is really important for that. There's another side to it too. In Vancouver, a lot of our framework for charging is now under our climate emergency action plan, which wants to see 50% of the kilometers traveled in the city be through zero emission vehicles by 2030. What that means is that it doesn't necessarily mean that half the vehicles need to be electric, but there's certainly an effort to get those higher mileage vehicles shifted over. So, the Ubers and Lyfts, the car sharing vehicles, those passenger fleets, I think are going to be really key to hitting that goal. And we need to have public charging to support them. Obviously, if we can get a home charging station for every Uber driver out there, that saves us all kinds of trouble, but that's probably going to be a bit of a challenge, given that a lot of them don't live in Vancouver. So again, having access to fast charging, if you're a two-way car sharing company, if we can find ways to dedicate charging to a given vehicle, or if we can create charging hubs for those one-way car share vehicles, all those things are really important.
Thanks, Ian. The climate emergency action plan with targeting 50% of journeys by 2030, I think it's just such a smart metric in terms of actually getting the higher, as you say, the higher mileage vehicles off the road. It's a great way to approach the transition. And looking forward, what's your view in terms of what's going to need to happen in terms of the number of chargers that are going to need to, how quickly and rapidly are we going to need to increase the number of chargers to be able to accommodate that kind of mileage, if you like?
Well, for us, I guess there's two pieces. There's sort of an equity push on the one side for the more general population. There's a lot of underserved areas in Vancouver which don't have a lot of charging infrastructure. In BC now, people can charge money for electricity if you're using EV charging. So there is a growing market of private sector providers out there, particularly with level 2. Business case for DC fast charging is still not amazing. But what we're seeing is that charging goes into places that already have kind of a strong business case. And so there are large pockets of the city that aren't well served. And those tend to be, lower income, higher residential, less commercial activity going on. And so one of the things we need to do is boost up a lot of numbers in those areas and making sure that, again, if people are tenants in a home, that they have a charger near to their home. In terms of the overall numbers of public charging, I like to support those other fleets. For car share vehicles, it's pretty much 1-to-1 in level 2. So for every car share vehicle we want to convert to electric, we need to put in a level 2 charger somewhere. I think in some scenarios we can probably spread those out and load share them and do some other interesting things with the technology. But in terms of ports, you're looking at 1-to-1. And then DC fast charging. By the end of next quarter, we expect that we'll have a DC fast charging hub within a 10-minute drive of anywhere in the city. We probably want to look at doubling that up at least in the next 5 years. And so that puts us, like right now, there are, not including Tesla superchargers, there's about 25 or 30 DC fast chargers across the city, I think. And then the Teslas bump that number up a fair bit beyond that. So we would probably look to want to double that or more in the next 5 to 7 years.
Right, so quite some significant infrastructure to go in. Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. And Mary, can you share why Brock University decided to invest in EV chargers and explain a little bit about the service they provide for your own fleet, for the campus and for the community at large?
Sure. For us, it was really an easy decision. Being in a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, we have a strong commitment with sustainability with our Niagara region. So we really wanted to spearhead something like this. We also had a growing demand of our community moving towards electric vehicles. So we wanted to support them by removing some of that range anxiety. We have people that come from Hamilton, Grimsby in their electric vehicles. We really wanted to support them and make sure that they felt at ease, that they can charge here and it's fine. We wanted to be part of that solution. And the Niagara region overall support the community to really help them embrace more of the EV charging and the EV vehicles as well. We are close to the Highway 406, so that made us a really good location for installing some of those. So we really have many good reasons. And probably the other one would be to demonstrate leadership. We are a medium-sized educational institution, so we have that flexibility and a more organic structure than some of our peers in Toronto. We have more leeway. So we wanted to demonstrate leadership by early adopting some of these technologies and being part of the movement.
That's great. And how would you say that reception has been so far in terms of that leadership positioning and so on?
It has been very well received. We have had our community, it has really spoken up, and we see the chargers now operational and we see them busy all the time. It has really increased the usage. We're getting good feedback from our users. It's something that people were really looking forward to, and they are appreciative now that they have come to campus after long 18 months. They are happy to see those. And so I think we're right on track. Oh, sorry, and you had mentioned the fleet. So we also are transitioning our fleet for personnel to electric vehicles. So we try not to encroach into what our community uses. We have our own in the building, but that's something that also has been very successful. In the last year and a half, we have bought 2 more electric vehicles, and it was never a question anymore about, do we want electric or do we want a regular vehicle? It was, okay, which electric vehicle are we purchasing? So it's something that it's good to hear from our community. Parking services, they are changing their vehicle. They said, I want an electric vehicle too. So it's been very well received.
Great. And how many electric vehicles does the university have in total? You mentioned 2, was it 2 or was it?
We have 3, 4 here in facilities management, and a couple more around campus from other departments.
Terrific. And just to clarify my understanding, so you've got separate chargers that service the fleet versus those for people attending the campus? That's
right.
Got it. Cool. Great. Thanks. So Flow, sorry, Brooks, I know that Flow's worked with a lot of diverse organizations. Obviously, we've obviously got a city and an academic institution here, but I know that your work expands a lot further than that. Thinking more broadly about some of these other types of site hosts, such as retailers and workplaces, what do you find their motivating factors are to install chargers? Why are people contacting you, and why are they doing this?
Yeah, a lot are contacting us just to contribute to overall sustainability, right? And be a part of the overall change. Like Ian mentioned, the 2030 change, right? A lot of people want to contribute to that, whether it's lead points into their building, into their infrastructure, having employees be attracted to work at those locations. For retailers, I would say it helps, what I like to say, keep eyes on the locations, right? And what I mean by that is, Kara mentioned PlugShare and Charge Hub apps that show the electric vehicle infrastructure throughout your communities or throughout your journey. They're really attracted to that, and having those chargers display on those maps, and also maps in OEM vehicles like GM and Nissan appear on the dashboards to attract people to go to those locations. You have to look too at how long people are sitting charging for, right? So that gets really attractive. An average person at a DC fast charger plugs in for 18 to 24 minutes, typically in warmer months, up to 30, 35 minutes in cold months. So you have a person there that could be purchasing other goods and services, going into restaurant, going into fast food, which makes it enticing and helps the business case of DCFC make more sense, right? Because you're not just looking at it from how much is the charger making, but how can I attract somebody to come to my property and spend more money there? That's a huge contributing factor. A lot of retailers, like shopping malls like Level 2 and DCFC, because they see people staying where an average in a mall shopping environment is about 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes. In level 2, when they have them, they actually see people sitting for an hour and a half to 3 hours. So longer time periods to attract customers in is a big contributing factor.
Right. So the business case really is much more than just the amount that they can charge for the use of that exact service. It's more about really the traffic and foot flow and what they can do with the customer when they're on site. Yeah,
if retailers are looking at it solely from a make revenue on EV charging, they're going to struggle, whether it's level 2 or DC. It is definitely around the greater environment and being creative with it.
Great. Well, we're going to touch a little bit more on some of the business model aspects in a moment. So thanks for that, Brooks. So in terms of financing charges, there is some significant public funding programs that are available. And one that's been running for a while now is the program called the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is run by Natural Resources Canada, a department of the federal government. And Cara, perhaps you could just explain a little bit more about the ZEV program, as it's often referred to, and just how it works and how people can access the funds.
Sure. So a ZEV, as we call it, Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, is, as you mentioned, available through NRCan. Now, the challenge of this particular program, am I frozen, Nino?
You're good. I'm hearing you well.
Am I okay?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I thought maybe it froze up for a sec. The challenge of this particular program is it's not sort of an apply and you shall receive kind of program. You have not everyone succeeds. So it's somewhat what I would say it's a competitive program. So you need to have something a little bit unique usually in your application to be successful. But if you are successful, they do fund up to 50% of the infrastructure, and it can be for a large block of chargers, not just 1 or 2. It can be, I think, the last round. They're going to do a new round, and we don't know what the rules will be, but the past round, there was up to 20 level 2s and 2 DC fast chargers. And so it was quite substantial. And we're told that there'll be a new round, and the new rounds have been focusing also on multi-unit, as Ian mentioned. That's a real challenge. So multi-unit residential, which is more level 2, and commercial. So it's not just for public charging at, en route on highway stops. It can be for home charging in multi-unit residential.
And so the same would apply for a workplace potentially as well, where the charges are being deployed for.
That's right. Also workplace, yes. Right. Some of the money did go towards workplace charging as well. So that can be for both a fleet and for employees. So it gives you some options there in terms of what you apply for.
I know that Plug and Drive's done some advisory work for workplace people thinking of workplace charging.
Yeah, we have a great guide available that's generic in terms of, it just goes through all the questions that so many people have asked us in terms of, things to consider when you're thinking about workplace charging. So everything from like, how many, and should I have a payment system, and how do I know how many people might do it, and all the kind of questions that we seem to get over and over.
Cool, thanks, Cara. And just a reminder for the audience to, if you have questions for the panelists, please do feel free to put them directly into the Q&A, and then we'll be aiming to get as many of those as we can to the questions at the end. And so, Ian, just referencing
and the only other thing, Nino.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one more thing, Nino, that I noticed, and you reported on it, that some of the candidates for the Ontario election have already indicated that they would top up that NRCan funding with provincial money should they be successful. So that's good to know.
So something to look out for in the Ontario election as it takes place next year. Thanks, Cara. Yeah, so Ian, it would be great to just just speaking perhaps a little bit more depth regarding the federal program, the ZEV program that Cara was just explaining. I know the City of Vancouver has been successful in some of these funding applications, and I wonder if you could share some of the examples of some of the projects that you've rolled out under ZEV, and perhaps also, if I can ask you a two-pronged question, to maybe at the end chat about some of the provincial incentives that you've also been able to apply for through Clean BC, for example.
Sure. So yeah, we have been successful twice to the 2018 and 2019 ZEV applications. The first round was strictly for deploying DC fast charging, and we were lucky enough to get 6 new DC fast chargers around the city, which was great because I think at the time we only had 2, so that tripling or quadrupling our network was definitely a good thing. And then the second round we applied again for public charging, but this time it was a mix of both DC fast charging and level 2. So in this new case, which we're just finishing implementing now, we're looking at DC fast chargers in some kind of key corridor or like hub charging locations, and then level 2 charging that we're deploying at a number of our community centers around the city. Again, part of that sort of filling out the network and sort of plugging holes, if you will, in the network, finding some of those community centers, which are, I think, really ideal locations for level 2, given that the dwelling time tends to be about 2 or 3 hours, which, as Brooks noted, that's a good level 2 charging time. So both of those have been excellent for us. And then, yeah, with the Clean BC, that just allowed us to top up. So as folks may or may not know, if you're applying to NRCan, it's like a matched funding kind of thing. Like they're covering only half of your project cost, in most cases up to a limit. So, for local governments, not every municipal government necessarily has a large capital budget for EV charging the way that Vancouver does. And so coming to the table to pay for half of that, you're a little bit more limited in what you can apply for, on top of the staff resources to actually do the application. So having access to the Clean BC provincial top-up has meant that we've been able to make our contribution go quite a lot further. We've been able to add in a fair bit more charging and possibly deploy charging outside of those grants because we had budget left over that was covered by the provincial numbers. So yeah, it's been immensely helpful to us.
And as you've got so many, sure, competing demands for charging, how do you decide which programs you're going to use to apply for funding? Like, so what's your criteria for, right, this is a good project to apply for funding for?
Well, generally we try and have we generally have a list of sites we'd like to approach in the first place. And so, we'll see if there are ones that match a given program that's out there. I know early versions of ZEV really looked at having fast charging like along highway corridors. And Vancouver, we're very lucky in that we don't have freeways going through the city, but that does make it a little bit more challenging. However, we do have a few streets that are sort of classified as provincial highways. And so, finding projects that we were planning on doing anyway, that were maybe near to or on those corridors was really helpful. Certainly we look at staff resources. Some applications are very time intensive and we only have so many people on a team. So far we haven't had too many we've had to turn down, other than, the project criteria didn't necessarily, and when I say turn down, I mean not apply for. I don't think we've ever turned down money. But yeah, we haven't had any that we haven't necessarily had to avoid applying for, unless they were just completely outside of what we were trying to do with our program. I would say that, and that's been fairly rare. One thing I will note, actually, there have been a couple of NRCan grants that have allowed for like third parties to act as like maybe an aggregator for funds. And we've looked at those and they're a bit more challenging for us as a city because we're not really allowed to give money away unless you're a nonprofit or an academic institution. We can't really give out grants. And so for us to act as a funding agency is very challenging. So that's one area that we have stayed away from because it hasn't really fit with what we're allowed to do legally.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And we'll chat a little bit more about some regional incentives in a minute, if I can just invite Brooks in. But just for those who are on the who are enjoying the discussion and aren't watching the chat, I would just like to share a comment from Louise Tanky from NRCan, who's just inviting the audience. If you would like an invitation to apply to our next RFP, please send us your contact information at taf-tcr@nrcan-rn-can.gc.ca. So you can find that email address more accurately in the chat column here, and also Louise has shared a link to the relevant page. So I just encourage you audience to check that out. So Brooks, yeah, just on the regional incentives side, there's a number of programs available across Canada, and Cara touched on a few of those from a vehicle point of view. But it'd be great if you could just highlight any other provincial programs of note, and also, again, another two-pronged question, how Flow can support applications from some smaller organisations who might not be able to qualify for the minimum size or scale of project required.
Yeah, and I think that's what's exciting with the NRCan funding that's coming out now, and that's out. So Ian mentioned about the delivery agent program. So Cara spoke well about the NRCan program for the ZEV side of things, which is typically 20 level 2s or above, and then a number of DC fast chargers. That makes it kind of hard for smaller organizations or rural organizations, rural communities to apply for that fund, because the 20 is kind of a hard threshold to get to. The programs have been great in what's been deployed. You have to keep in mind NRCan is a small team, right, that are managing these funds. So what they've done is created a number of delivery organizations that are typically non-for-profits. Some utilities are participating as well, that can now extend funding locally to organizations looking for 1 charger, 2 chargers, 3 chargers, 20 chargers, up to 20. So it becomes a lot easier to actually apply now for those smaller organizations that have been waiting for something. Maybe, for example, in Ontario really hasn't had a provincial fund since about 2017, 2018. Right? So there's a lot of Ontario firms waiting for those delivery organizations. Last I've heard, delivery organizations are gearing up to start marketing their programs starting basically in January. So be on the lookout for those. But then there's also other provincial funding methods. Ian mentioned one as well in BC that can actually stack for DCFC, for example. So you get $50,000 from NRCan, $25,000 from the provincial fund to take advantage of helping to offset that installation cost or hardware cost further. And a lot of provinces are kind of following that lead, and more will adopt it. So you're best to really kind of look at the NRCan side of things, because a lot of times NRCan will list which other funds can be piggybacked and added on top of theirs, and then go directly locally as well. And our local teams can help with all of that as well.
Great. And do you have a sense of other provinces that are offering similar initiatives?
There are some stuff in the Maritimes. There are some others coming down in the prairies as well. So 2022, 2023 are going to be exciting years for, I would say, programs coming. Yeah.
Excellent, that's great. And I can see just another comment in the chat just for all the audience. JM Torrell has highlighted that for organisations and indigenous communities in BC, there's also the Clean BC Go Electric program that is managed here at Plug-in BC that has successfully approved nearly 30 sites across the province, and there's a link here as well for that people can find. So I just wanted to share that. Okay, so Mary, it would be good to understand a little bit about Brock's process in terms of applying for ZEV funding, because obviously you've been successful in this regard in previous rounds. Could you share what the application process was like? Is obviously there's often a lot of work involved in these kind of things, and also what it meant for you to work with a company like Flow that was able to support you with that application process.
It was an internal effort. It was led by one of our project managers also our energy manager himself, and the manager of electrical services here at Brock. So it was a joint effort, really, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was successful. It had buy-in from different areas. But we found we did have that gap. We had some chargers already, but it was a larger scale. It was different to what we had done before, and that's really what Flow did for us. They educated us as customers to what other alternatives were there, what we may want, what our requirements were. They really guided us through the process of determining what we needed. These applications, they are not easy. They do require thought and planning and a good costing and analysis. That said, it's not unlike other applications that we have applied for federal and provincial as well. But it does take some knowledge so that you can then submit something that's actually robust, that has a good chance of success. And that's where we saw the partnership between our internal stakeholders and Flow to really have something that we could work towards, to have decent timelines, to have a good idea of what we were trying to achieve, what was actually achievable, and to understand more about what we were getting ourselves into. I think that was a major thing, because when we approached our senior leaders and we told them we need 50% more, because if we are successful, we would be needing to put in 50% of the capital. So explaining to them, having that base knowledge that we had been provided before, that was really crucial in making sure that they would support this initiative with confidence. Like, oh, okay, so you know the process, you have really thought this through. There you go. Those are the resources. Go ahead, and looking forward to it. We even had some of our board members speak about how now they are going to be charging here on campus because they have an electric vehicle. So it was a very positive experience. And again, it's not more or less work than what we have seen for other projects, ZEV, cap and trade. So it's not really something that I would say people should be scared of. It does require planning, but any project does. So that's what I would say.
Great, thanks very much, Mary. It's good to hear about how you really got your internal stakeholders aligned in the process, as well as obviously focusing externally. Well, let's take that point on a little bit further about the business model, and in terms of how to make the financial justification for deploying chargers. Ian, could you talk a little about the low carbon fuel standard credit and how the city uses these to actually help offset the costs?
Sure, absolutely. So for folks who aren't familiar with the BC low carbon fuel regulation, it's basically a regulation to require fuel providers, more traditional fuel providers, to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels over time. And generally what this has meant is that it's created a credit market for EV charge, or for any kind of low carbon fuel, but electricity counts as a transportation fuel in that context. And so if you are a provider of electricity for EV charging, you can trade into this market. And right now it is in BC, it's a seller's market. I think a lot of the oil and gas industry is quite anxious to find ways to buy credits. And what that means is as a provider of EV charging, you're looking at credit values that are significantly higher than the cost of electricity. And so you can find ways to get a good return on your investment. For us, certainly for level 2, it makes the return on maybe more marginally used locations quite a bit faster. It makes the return on DC fast charging a little better. It still tends to be a little bit on the negative side depending on the utilization, but much closer to actually a break even or a positive business case depending on how it's used. And it also allows us to generate credits for maybe other innovative programs. I mentioned earlier about trying to encourage car sharing to get into EVs. If we can find ways to support them through infrastructure, and maybe we can ease up on our operating costs and really not have to download all the additional network fees and other operating costs of EV charging to the car sharing providers. If we can have that covered by claiming low carbon fuel credits, that really has helped us bring in some more innovative programs and deploy more infrastructure. So I think it really does help to level the playing field in terms of providing public infrastructure, especially if they're not very high utilization locations, which tends to be when they're first going in. As adoption goes up and as people find the stations, it tends to get pretty good. Certainly our downtown locations, I think, have a pretty solid business case on their own. But so many other parts of the city. And again, as I mentioned, those areas that maybe are more marginal from a business case, we can more easily justify it and then have more equitable distribution of the network.
Thanks, Ian. That's really helpful. And Cara, beyond the financial equations, can you elaborate on some of the other benefits for workplaces and retailers of installing EV chargers? Flo touched on a few of them previously, but we'd love to know what you're hearing from your experience.
Yeah, I think a few have been mentioned, but of course, more and more employees want to work for a company that they think is caring about the environment, and putting in chargers is one way to show that the company is thinking about these things. And just even one step further, they want to help their employees live more sustainably. So by offering charging, I mean, in the past, maybe it was wellness programs or things related to health that companies were sort of almost table stakes to do for employees, in terms of benefits. Now there's a lot more focus on environmental benefits that you can offer to your employees. So EV charging is one. And of course, you can make the business case for the charging stations a little more robust if you combine, let's say, fleet and employees to sort of justify, because like a lot of times it's hard to justify for employees, especially if you don't have a good sense of how many employees will do it. But if you already have some fleet vehicles, that those stations will get some usage, and then you can perhaps have the fleet using them at night, whereas you have the employees using them during the day, for example. So that's another way, another sort of multi-benefit. And then finally, I would just say you might think about, I know we're, still a lot of us working from home and still Zooming like we're doing right now. But it is actually a really good time to look at putting in charging infrastructure, because there aren't a lot of people around. And so it might be the best time when the parking lot isn't so busy to think about doing your planning and installation during this time.
Thanks, Cara. And Mary, as somebody who's actually gone through the process of installing them, would you like to elaborate on Cara's comments at all in terms of the benefits that you're experiencing at Brock?
Absolutely. We have noticed how it triggered the development of new partnerships. I think that's one of the bigger ones. We started conversations with Sheridan College, with the town of Oakville, who are also installing more of EV charging stations, also via ZEV. So we started conversations about how we can connect what they are doing to what we're doing, and people commuting between our cities. So that was something that was an unexpected benefit, just start conversations with other broader public sector institutions and how we can collaborate. Also, we became closer to some of the departments at Brock. We were typically just parking services are on their own, facilities management. So we really became much of a tighter group. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages, because now we're more engaged, we're really being more effective. And that's something that we hope to translate into other projects and initiatives as well. The installation and operation of the EV charges, really, it facilitates the expansion. So the next time around, when we start to see that there's a growing need and more adoption, we will be far more confident. So that knowledge portion of it, it's something intangible, but we know that now our project managers, our electrical team, they are more confident and more comfortable around them. So we have that knowledge that we acquired. And finally, but not least though, opportunities for research. Now we're starting to think, well, we have been hearing about vehicle to grid charging. So maybe we need to get us one of those units and start playing with it or looking into those. So it's opening the door to more research, to more opportunities that will create the campus become a living lab itself.
Terrific, thanks, Mary. Just before we move it, we've got a whole bunch of questions, so we're going to be getting to those very, very shortly. And just before we do, Brooks, could you just give us a sense of timelines? And as has already been discussed, a new ZEV program is is on its way. So for anyone thinking who's applying for this funding, at what stage of their thinking should they start applying, and if they want to tap into flow support, how quickly should they contact you about that, and what should they have organized before they do?
I would say the earlier the better to contact. The nice thing about the NRCan program is NRCan reviews every application in detail. Like Kara said, it's not a first come, first serve. It's a very fair process. But the more information that you have and the more storyline you have in your application, the better, to help them understand what they're approving and does it meet the goals of the actual program. So the earlier you can reach out, the better. Part of the best thing to do in the overall exploration is get quotes from contractors, from EV charging players, and have some idea from a financial timeline on what you're going to have to contribute. Because in most cases, you have to contribute maybe 50% or 80%, depending on the fund that you're actually applying to. So it will give you some kind of idea. Like Mary said, she had to educate some of her internal teams, right, on the overall financial budget. That is usually what I find takes the longest period of time in an organization when they're applying, because you have to educate the CFO and who's actually going to outfit the cost, right? So the earlier you do that, the better. So reaching out to organizations like us, ASAP is key. NRCan does typically post their roadmap timeline on when new funding is going to be released and what the programs are going to be. And typically within like a 95%, 98% accuracy rate, they piggyback from the same type of applications as what was used before. So you can do a lot of preparation before they even release the fund to be ahead of the game.
And actually, you know, maybe if I could just jump in on that, because I think Brooks raised a really good point that I think Mary's getting at as well. For local governments, a lot of the time you may even need to go to your city council in order to get funds if you don't have it in your budget, and often that's not a quick process to get on a council agenda and go through those. So again, having that plan in advance, as Brooks mentioned, really does help get the application process to go through, because there's often extra hoops to jump through at the government level.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. Okay, great. Well, we'll kick off with some of the audience questions, and I'm just going to pile straight in and just open this one up to anyone in the audience. What challenges have you experienced with local electrical contractors? Who leads the installations of the hardware? And Brooks, you touched on this in your comments just now, so I don't know if you'd like to touch on that, and any other panelists.
I think early on, what I found was a lot of electrical contractors were charging more than what they should be, because they knew how much funding was coming. So that was in the early days, like the 2017 eras, 2018 eras. It's always good to get a couple of quotes, right? In many cases, it can be far cheaper to use the on-site electrical contractor that takes care of that building to help you push out that money, right? And extend that 50% or 80% funding coverage. So doing that due diligence is really, really key.
Great, thanks, Brooks. After installing chargers, are there any metrics that we should be tracking to report on, or to assist us in future business cases? And it would just be good maybe to start with Mary and Ian, just to see how you're monitoring them right now, what metrics you might be using or not.
We're counting the individual number of users in the stations. Right now we are, for example, at 43, and they are unique users. It doesn't say how often they would be using, but we're tracking that number. So we used to have much less than that. So we have certainly seen that increase now that we have the information. And that has been one of the biggest metrics so far.
And so that's really interesting, Mary, because for us, we don't typically track individual unique users. We might look at like numbers of sessions on kind of an ad hoc basis, but the two primary metrics that we look at are utilization overall, like how full is it during the day, and then also the energy that we're actually dispensing. And so the first one is because we set our user fees on kind of a sliding scale we treat our charging stations a lot of times like parking meters. And so high use stations, we tend to raise the price to encourage turnover, to make sure that people aren't sitting on them. And so we want to see kind of utilization within a given band. And similarly, if it's really low, we will drop the price as well, because we are trying to be as competitive as possible with fossil fuels. And then the energy usage is primarily just for that low carbon fuel standard accounting that we do annually to claim those credits.
Thanks. I don't know if Brooks or Cara have anything to add on metrics once they're in.
Yeah, actually, I had a thought, Nino. I was just thinking that one of the things that we've learned just from some of the workplaces that we've spoken to who've put in charging, and they'll often do, employee satisfaction surveys and try to understand, how it's being used and how people feel about it. And what they learned was that one of the big things of putting in chargers actually just encouraged a lot more people to get an EV, which, they go into it thinking we'll be catering to the people who have one or already thinking about it, but they didn't realize that actually just putting that in actually encouraged a lot of people who were on the fence. And recent studies said something like, for each person that's already there, it encourages 6 more people just through word of mouth and talking about the stations and talking with their colleagues. So that's pretty impressive and pretty important in this time when we're trying to encourage more and more people to make the switch.
Thanks, Cara. And Brooks, I know of in some retail scenarios, they're actually looking at the impact on footfall and traffic of when they introduce EV chargers into certain locations. I don't know if you've got some direct experience of that.
Sorry, what was that? The which traffic?
Some retailers actually looking at the impact on sales or installing EV chargers. So I don't know if there's anything you'd like to elaborate on that.
So the Flow network, we touch about 80% of EV drivers across Canada. So we have different metrics that we can say to a site host, for example, hey, it's time or it's becoming time to add more stations based on usage and based on where we see members coming from. Not in a direct visit individual like Nino visited your location, but we can say, hey, there were these many people, it's now time to expand based on our knowledge and cascading environment across our 55,000 stations that are deployed on the ground. So we have different metrics for that. There are a lot of retailers, there's a lot of questions going around about petroleum companies, right? Petro-Canada, Co-op is getting involved. Canadian Tire has been involved with us since about 2017, and they do see increases in foot traffic and in spending at the locations.
Great, thank you. So another question from the audience, that smaller towns and First Nations don't necessarily have the funds to install chargers or as many resources to access the knowledge and understanding about them. That can hinder long distance travel. How best to educate these areas or to get into the trend? I guess there's a broader, so I think it's broader than education, because obviously there's also a funding point there, but I'd be really interested to hear what the panelists, what solutions the panelists can identify there.
Yeah, Nino, I'll jump in there. Actually, I was just chatting with a fellow at a place called Indigenous Clean Energy, ICE, and they actually were one of the recipients of the third-party NRCan funding to help distribute to specifically Indigenous communities. So if somebody on this webinar is interested, they can contact me or reach out to ICE, Indigenous Clean Energy. They are going to be soon launching their program to offer charging stations specifically to more remote and rural Indigenous communities.
That's awesome. Sounds fantastic. I don't know if anyone else has a comment to add there. Okay. So a comparison with Norway here. As many people I know on the panel know, obviously a world leader in EV adoption, similar climate to ours in many ways. Are there lessons we can learn from Oslo regarding charger to EV ratio levels, charging ease of use and standards, and So yeah, would anybody like to comment on anything that they regard as best practice, which we don't currently have here, that we could do with?
I could jump in with a couple of thoughts. Certainly, it's always a challenge to compare to European cities, because one of the things that they do have going for them are different utility voltages, which is fairly technical, but it's actually quite a lot easier to drop a level 2 station on the curbside if you're in a European city, because it's already running at 220, which means you don't need to have a separate transformer. There's simply less space taken up in the streetscape and less cost and time to do those projects. And so, I know, for example, Amsterdam is one where they will often just, they know a street needs some chargers. Maybe they've had a request from a resident, and they'll just go in and put chargers down the whole street. And that becomes a much more challenging prospect when you're dealing with higher utility voltages and charging stations that don't necessarily speak to that. So that's one piece. Also, they have a couple of other things. One technical thing that I quite like is that they have removable cables for their lower power charging stations in Europe, which means, again, it's less obtrusive in your streetscape. It's much easier to just put a box there, and that the driver is going to have the cable in their trunk and they can plug in. But then also, finally, a lot of European cities do own the land, a lot more of the land, and they have a lot of different sort of legal powers. But overall, I think that one of the things that they do benefit from is just a big push on public charging. There's a lot less new development in a lot of Northern European cities, and so they don't rely necessarily on home construction requirements. And so they've really pushed on getting lots and lots of level 2 out there in particular. And I think that that's obviously been very helpful. And then, high taxes on fossil fuels is also really helpful.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ian. Lots of great points there. Somewhat topical, particularly from a BC point of view. Are we looking at an emergency charge requirements, for example, floods, fire, electrical failures caused by storms, for instance? And so a point on resiliency. How do we address that with chargers?
Very timely question, given that we are in the midst of fuel rationing here. And so the only people who really have much assurance of getting their vehicle fueled are the EV drivers right now. We don't have any specific requirements around that, although as a city, we're starting to think about it. We just bought our first electric fire truck. And so we certainly need to think about that. I think that there is potential, as battery storage gets cheaper, you can have those sort of standalone storage situations. Generally speaking, our utility grid, our gas, let's try that one more time. Our electrical grid is a little bit more resilient than for example, an oil pipeline. So in many ways, I think that just being electric is more resilient. BC Hydro is very much set up to do rapid response repairs. You don't tend to see long outages in a given area for that. So I think that, and it's a broader network because it's, redundant substations and so forth, as opposed to having, one pipeline that feeds the area. So I think that overall we're in a good position, but it is something we're starting to think about now as we move into sort of broader emergency fleets being electrified.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much for that answer. And we really have crashed out of time. So I want to say big thanks to the audience for all your questions. I'm really sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. Massive thanks to our panelists, Cara, Mary, Ian and Brooks, for just being so knowledgeable and bringing great expertise to this discussion. And I would like to also just give a big thank you once again to Flow EV Charging for sponsoring this discussion and making this webinar possible today. We will be sharing a link to the recording of this webinar in the next few days on electricautonomy.ca. And this concludes the Electric Autonomy's full series of webinar panel discussions on the development of EV charging infrastructure. You can find recordings and summaries of the previous discussions online at electricautonomy.ca. So thanks very much for joining us, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.